The red line on the star chart had not moved in 130 years. Commander Threll Voidmarked stood on the bridge of the Wrath flagship Ashcrown, staring at that line the way a starving man stares at a locked door. Every other border in the galaxy had been redrawn a dozen times by war, trade, or conquest. This one never changed. No probes went in. No probes came out. Just a warning, repeated in 11 dead languages across the boundary beacons. Human space. Do not enter. It's a bluff, Threll said, more to himself than to the officers around him. 100 years of silence isn't strength. It's cowardice wearing a mask. Behind him, an old voice disagreed. Or it's patience, said Sale, the fleet's xenobiologist, a Wrath elder with silver-veined skin and eyes that had seen 3 wars end badly. Patience is not the same as weakness, Commander. Sometimes it is the opposite. Threll didn't turn around. He was 34 years old, the youngest fleet commander in Wrath history, and he had not clawed his way to that chair by listening to elders warn him about ghosts. The Dominion was hungry. Systems were running out of resources. And beyond that red line sat an empty, unguarded stretch of space 3 times the size of the Dominion's entire territory. Untouched, unclaimed, and according to every scan his ships had ever run, completely undefended. Scans show nothing, Threll said. No fleets, no weapons platforms, no signals. Just empty space and a myth some frightened ancestor decided to paint red on a map. The architects thought the same thing about humanity once, Sale said quietly. There are no architects left to regret it. That got a few uneasy glances from the younger officers. Threll clenched his jaw. He'd heard the old stories. Every species had a version of them, passed down like campfire tales to frighten hatchlings. Don't go near the humans. Don't wake what's sleeping. He didn't believe in monsters. He believed in fuel reserves, expanding borders, and the council seat waiting for him if this mission succeeded. We are not declaring war, Threll said, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. We are conducting a survey. If the humans are still out there, we introduce ourselves. If they're gone, extinct, faded, whatever happened to them, then that space is ours for the taking. Either way, the Dominion needs an answer, and I intend to bring them one. Sale said nothing more. She simply looked at the boundary line on the view screen, the way someone looks at a grave they've been told not to dig up. The order was given. 63 ships, cruisers, frigates, and the flagship at their heart began their slow, deliberate crossing into the space no one had entered in over a century. For the first 4 hours, nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than an attack would have been. Threll paced the bridge, watching sensor readouts that showed absolutely nothing. No ships, no stations, no debris, no life signs. Just stars, quiet and indifferent, the way they'd looked for 100 years. Sensors are clean across all frequencies, reported Lieutenant Casa, a young officer who'd volunteered for this mission, hoping it would make his career. It's like flying into an empty room. Keep scanning, Threll said. Empty rooms don't stay empty forever. He was right. At the edge of the fleet's sensor range, 17 small relay beacons had been quietly blinking for longer than anyone in the fleet had been alive. Old human hardware, presumably abandoned, presumably dead. Wrath intelligence had cataloged them decades ago and dismissed them as inert debris, leftover infrastructure from a civilization no one had heard from in generations. At 0347 fleet time, all 17 beacons went dark. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply silently extinguished. Every single one across a distance of nearly 2 light-years in the exact same instant. Commander, Cass's voice had changed. The confidence was gone. Commander, I need you to see this. Threll crossed the bridge in 3 strides and looked at the display. 17 dead lights where 17 dead lights shouldn't have been able to die together. Not with the light lag between them. Not unless something or someone had reached across 2 light-years and turned them off at once on purpose, like flipping a switch. Debris impact, Threll said, though even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Micrometeor storm. Something mundane. 17 beacons, Commander, Cassa said, simultaneously across a 2 light-year spread. There's no mundane explanation for that. Sale stepped up beside them, and for the first time since the mission began, Threll saw something in her face that unsettled him more than the readouts did. She wasn't afraid. She was sad. The particular sadness of someone who had hoped right up until this moment that she'd been wrong. "They know we're here," she said. "Impossible," Threll snapped. "There's been no contact, no signal exchange. Nothing has detected us. You're assuming they need to detect us the way we detect things." Sale said, "Commander, please. I am asking you formally on record. Reverse course. Whatever just happened, it wasn't an accident and it wasn't a malfunction. It was a message." Threll looked at the dead beacons on the screen, at the vast empty dark beyond them, and felt something crawl up the back of his neck that he refused to name as fear. He thought about the council seat. He thought about 100 years of Dominion ships going nowhere near this border, and how much territory that cowardice had cost them. He thought about how it would look if he turned this fleet around because of 17 lights going dark. "Hold formation," he said. "Continue the advance. If someone's out there, I want them to introduce themselves properly." The fleet pressed on into the dark. It took 11 more minutes before every screen on every ship in the Wrath fleet, 63 vessels, thousands of crew, every bridge, every console, every private terminal, flickered at exactly the same moment and displayed the same message in perfect, unaccented Wrath script, as if it had been waiting, patient and ready, for exactly this moment for over 100 years. "You were warned." Threll stared at the words around him. The bridge had gone utterly silent. Every officer frozen. Every system suddenly, impossibly connected to something that shouldn't have had access to any of it. Then, just as suddenly, the message vanished and the screens returned to normal. Threll opened his mouth to give an order. Any order. Something to break the silence. Something to prove he was still in control of his own ship. Before he could speak, every engine on every vessel in the fleet shut down at once, plunging 63 warships into total, drifting silence, dead in the black heart of forbidden human space. 63 warships hung dead in the dark, and not one of them could explain why. Threll stood at the center of a bridge full of people, trying very hard not to panic. Engineering had run every diagnostic twice. Every reactor was fully powered. Every system reported green, and yet nothing moved. No thrusters, no weapons, no shields, as if the ships themselves had simply decided to stop. "It's not a malfunction," Chief Engineer Dross reported over the comm, his voice tight. "The systems think they're working perfectly. They're just not doing anything. It's like they're waiting for permission." "Permission from who?" Threll demanded. No one answered because no one had an answer, and that silence frightened him more than any hostile fleet ever could have. For 6 hours, the Vecrath fleet drifted powerless deeper into human space on nothing but momentum. Threll used the time the only way he knew how, pacing, barking orders that accomplished nothing, and slowly, reluctantly, listening to Sale. "Tell me about the Architect War," he said, finally dropping into the chair beside her in the observation deck, watching stars slide past a ship that could no longer steer itself. Sale studied him for a long moment before she spoke, as if deciding whether he'd actually earned the answer. "Most records were destroyed," she said. "Not by accident. On purpose, by dozens of different species independently around the same time period. That alone should tell you something. When that many unconnected civilizations agree to bury the same history, it's not because the story is boring. What do the fragments say? That there was a species called the Architects. Ancient, methodical. They didn't conquer worlds. They audited them. They'd study a civilization, calculate its future trajectory, and if that civilization was judged too unpredictable, too dangerous, too likely to eventually threaten their model of galactic order." She paused. "They erased it cleanly, completely. Not war. Extermination as bookkeeping." Threll felt something cold settle in his chest. "And humanity?" "Humanity was flagged," Sale said. "Early. The fragment suggests they were flagged almost immediately. Too aggressive, too adaptive, too fast to learn. By every metric the Architects used, humans should have been erased within a decade of first contact. But they weren't." "No," Sale said. "They weren't. And after that, the records go dark. Every species that might know what actually happened either went extinct in the crossfire or agreed, all at once, never to speak of it again. All we're left with is the result. The architects stopped auditing anyone. Every trace of them simply vanished from galactic history, and every species old enough to remember agreed on one thing without ever comparing notes. What? Don't go near the humans. Sale looked away. Whatever they became to survive that war, it wasn't something anyone wanted to meet again. The observation deck was silent except for the hum of a ship that could not move. Threll looked out at the stars and, for the first time since this mission began, allowed himself to actually consider that he might have made a mistake. He was still considering it when the alarm sounded. Contact! Cass's voice cracked over the comm, and Threll was on his feet and moving before the word finished. Small vessel bearing 217, closing fast. No, wait! Delay that. It's not closing. It's just sitting there. Threll reached the bridge in under a minute. The main screen showed a single ship, small, sleek, unarmed as far as their scanners could tell, hanging motionless less than 10,000 kilometers from the flagship. It hadn't been detected approaching. It had simply appeared the way the message had simply appeared on every screen in the fleet. Scan it, Threll ordered. Already tried, Commander, Cassa said. It's not registering properly. Hull composition doesn't match anything in our database. No weapon signature, no shield signature. It's just there. One ship, Threll said, and something in him. Pride, maybe, or the desperate need to feel in control of something, pushed the fear back down. One unarmed ship against 63 warships. Whatever message they're trying to send, I don't think it's the one they intended, Sale said quietly. I don't think that ship is a threat assessment. I think it's a courtesy. Before Threll could ask what she meant, every comm channel on the Ashcrown opened at once. Not hacked, not overridden. Simply opened as easily as someone turning a doorknob that had never been locked in the first place. A voice came through, calm, human, tired in a way that suggested this was not a novel experience. This is Commander LRAOAE Human Boundary Watch, the voice said. You are currently 61 hours inside restricted space. Your fleet propulsion systems have been suspended, not disabled. That distinction matters, so I need you to listen carefully. Threll's hands curled into fists at his sides. This is Fleet Commander Threll Voidmarked of the Vekrath Dominion. By what authority have you disabled my ships? There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, Threll realized, but something closer to patience. The kind an adult might show a child who had just asked a question they weren't ready to understand the answer to. The same authority that's kept this border quiet for 130 years, LRA said. You crossed a line that isn't there to keep you out of our space, Commander. It's there to keep the rest of the galaxy safe from what happens when someone doesn't respect it. Threll's jaw tightened. On the screen, the small, impossible ship sat perfectly still, giving away nothing. Is that a threat? No, LRA said, and for the first time, her voice softened into something that sounded almost like regret. It's a countdown. You have 60 seconds to order your fleet to reverse course. After that, I don't get to make this decision for you anymore. Sale grabbed Threll's arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. Commander, give the order now. Whatever Pride is telling you to do, ignore it. Give the order. Threll looked at the small ship on the screen. One vessel against 63, unarmed, unafraid, utterly certain of itself in a way that made every instinct in his body scream that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Reverse course, he said. Cannot be executed. Our engines are disabled. You disabled them. There was a silence on the line, brief and heavy. I know, LRA said quietly. I'm sorry, Commander. I really am. That's not a threat either. I mean that, but I already told you, after 60 seconds, this isn't my decision anymore. The channel closed. On the bridge of the Ashcrown, 63 warships sat dead in space. And every clock, every console, every screen across the entire fleet began silently and simultaneously to count down from 60. 59 seconds. The numbers fell on every screen across 63 ships, and no one on the bridge of the Ashcrown could look away from them. Threll had fought in 3 border skirmishes and 1 full campaign against a rival Dominion house. He had watched ships burn. He had given orders that got people killed and told himself it was necessary. Nothing in that experience had prepared him for the particular terror of watching a countdown he could not stop, delivered by an enemy who sounded genuinely sorry about it. "Weapons," he said. "Target that ship. All batteries." "Commander, our systems are still suspended," Casa said, hands flying across a console that wasn't responding the way it should. "I can arm the weapons, but I don't think." "Do it anyway." Sale stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "Threll, listen to me. Everything we know says this is a mistake. Everything we know is second-hand myth and dead records." Threll snapped, though his voice shook more than he wanted it to. "I need something real. I need to see what they're capable of before I decide whether to be afraid of it." On the screen, the small human vessel hadn't moved. It hung there, patient, giving no indication it even registered the weapons now powering up across the Wrath fleet. 45 seconds. "Arm complete," Casa said. "Commander, I have a firing solution." Threll thought of Sale's warning. He thought of the council seat and the 100 years of Dominion cowardice that had left this entire sector unclaimed. He thought mostly of how it would feel to be the commander who ran from one unarmed ship in front of his entire crew. Fire. A single pulse of energy, more than enough to vaporize a vessel that size, streaked across the 10,000 kilometers separating the 2 ships in less than a second. It never arrived. Threll watched it happen on the screen, watched his own weapon simply stop mid-flight. The energy dispersed into a soft, harmless shimmer that faded into nothing, as if the fabric of space itself had reached out and gently taken the shot away. The bridge went silent. "Report," Threll said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Weapon discharge confirmed," Casa said, staring at his console like it had betrayed him. "Impact not confirmed. The shot just... It's gone, Commander. It didn't miss. It didn't hit shields. It just stopped existing." On the main screen, the channel reopened. LRA's voice returned, and this time there was no anger in it. Only a tired, aching sadness that somehow felt worse than fury would have. "I really hoped you wouldn't do that," she said. "I mean it. I've done this 11 times in my career, Commander. 11 fleets, 11 warnings. Only 3 of them opened fire. You just became the 4th. What are you?" Threll demanded. And he no longer cared how the question sounded, whether it made him look weak in front of his crew. He needed to know. "What just happened to my weapon?" There was a pause before LRA answered. And when she did, her voice had changed. Not colder, but more distant, like someone reciting words they'd said too many times to feel the weight of them anymore. "You didn't listen," she said. "None of them ever do." 30 seconds. Sale grabbed Threll's shoulder, her eyes wide with something beyond fear now. A kind of grim, resigned understanding. "Commander, I need you to hear me. This isn't a battle. It was never going to be a battle. I think this is a test, and I think we already failed it." "A test for what?" "I don't know," Sale admitted. "But whatever's coming in the next 30 seconds, I don't think firing again will change the outcome. I think the only thing left to decide is how we face it." Threll looked at the small, silent human ship on the screen, still perfectly motionless, still giving away nothing. And for the first time in his career, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a hatchling standing in front of forces too large to understand. The total, crushing certainty that he was not in control of anything happening around him. 20 seconds. He thought about ordering the fleet to scatter, though he knew somehow that it wouldn't matter. He thought about opening a channel to apologize, though he doubted there was anything left to say that hadn't already been said. He thought strangely of his mother, who had begged him not to take this commission, who had told him ambition without wisdom was just recklessness wearing better armor. 15 seconds. "Sale," he said quietly, "if this is the end." "It's not the end," Sale interrupted, and something in her voice made him look at her. She wasn't looking at the countdown. She was looking at the small human vessel, studying it with the focused intensity of a scientist who had just noticed something everyone else had missed. "Commander, look at their ship. Really look at it." Threll forced himself to focus past the fear, past the ticking numbers, and understood what she meant. The vessel had no visible weapon ports, no shield emitters, no armor plating beyond a hull that looked almost fragile compared to the battlecruisers surrounding it. It wasn't a warship. It had never been a warship. "If that's not a warship," Threll said slowly, "then what just stopped my weapon?" "I don't think it was the ship," Sale said. "I think it was never the ship." 10 seconds. Elleray's voice returned one final time, quiet, almost gentle, cutting through the silence of the bridge like something final. "For what it's worth, Commander, I don't hate you for this. None of us do. You did what your instincts told you to do, and your instincts were built by a galaxy that taught you strength is the only language worth speaking." A pause. "You're about to learn a different one." 5 seconds. Threll gripped the edge of his console, watching the numbers fall, watching 63 ships full of people who trusted him hang helpless in the dark, and realized with a terror sharper than anything he'd felt yet that he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Only that whatever it was already far, far beyond anything he could stop. 0. Every light on the bridge of the Ash Crown went out at once, plunging the ship into total darkness. And in that darkness, Threll heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound, faint and impossible, of his own ship beginning gently and precisely to come apart around him. The lights came back on before Threll could scream, and what he saw was somehow worse than the dark had been. The bridge was intact. He was intact. Every crew member around him was alive, gripping their consoles, breathing hard, but alive. The sound he'd heard, the sound of his ship coming apart, hadn't been the hull failing around him. It had been something far stranger. Outside the viewport, sections of the Ash Crown's outer hull were peeling away in slow, deliberate sheets, panel by panel, like the careful hands of a surgeon opening a body rather than the violence of a weapon tearing one apart. Weapon emplacements detached and drifted free, whole and undamaged. Engine cores powered down and disconnected cleanly from their housings. Nothing exploded. Nothing burned. The ship was simply being taken apart, piece by piece, with a precision that made Threll's skin crawl. "Life support is still active," Dross reported over the comm, his voice shaking. "Hull integrity is compromised. But, Commander, it's not falling apart randomly. It's being disassembled. Every non-essential system removed in sequence. Whoever's doing this isn't trying to kill us." "Then what are they trying to do?" Threll shouted. He got his answer a moment later when the same thing happened to every other ship in the fleet. Across 63 vessels, the same silent, surgical process unfolded in perfect synchronization. Weapons detaching, shield generators powering down and drifting free, propulsion systems disengaging piece by piece, while every crew compartment, every life support system, and every escape pod remained fully intact. It was, Threll realized with a horror that went beyond fear into something closer to awe, not an attack at all. It was a disarmament. "Report from the Kais," Cassa said, his voice hollow. "Their entire weapons array just detached. All of it. They're not firing on anyone. They can't. And they're not damaged, Commander. The crew is confirming 0 casualties fleet-wide." Threll stared at the wreckage of his own weapon systems drifting silently past his viewport, whole and functional, simply no longer attached to his ship. 63 warships stripped of every capacity to fight, and not one life lost in the process. "How?" he whispered. "How is this even possible?" Sale was on her knees beside a console, not out of fear, but because her legs had simply given out beneath her, her breathing shallow, one hand pressed to her chest. Threll dropped down beside her. "Sale, I'm not injured," she said, though her voice was faint and her silver-veined skin had gone pale. "This is shock, Commander, not wounds. I've spent 40 years studying dead civilizations that tried to guess what humanity became. I never thought I'd live to see the answer." She managed a thin, humorless smile. "It seems the price of finding out is a heart too old to handle it." With a clarity that frightened him, Threll realized that his pride had already cost him everything it was going to cost him today. He followed her onto the shuttle. The station they arrived at 20 minutes later was unlike anything in Vrath architecture. Quiet, unadorned, functional in a way that suggested its purpose had never been to impress anyone. Threll was led through corridors lined with old photographs, handwritten notes, and what looked like painstakingly maintained archives until LRA brought him to a small room where an elderly human sat waiting, surrounded by books and data terminals in equal measure. "Commander Threll Voidmarked," the old man said, rising slowly to greet him. "Dr. Eris Voss, I've spent the last 40 years of my life doing exactly what I'm about to do for you, trying to make sure the people who survive this crossing go home understanding what actually happened to them." "Then explain it," Threll said, more exhausted than demanding now. "Please, I've lost someone today because I refused to believe a myth. I'd like to know what the myth was hiding." Voss gestured for him to sit and slowly, patiently began to speak. "A long time ago, before most galactic records even begin, humanity encountered a species called the Architects," he said. "You may have heard fragments of this already. The Architects didn't conquer the way your Dominion understands conquest. They audited civilizations, calculated their long-term trajectory, and erased anyone who scored too high on a scale of unpredictability. Humanity was audited early, and humanity was judged extremely unpredictable. By every metric the Architects used, we should have been erased within a decade. But you weren't." "No," Voss said. "Because somewhere in that war, and it was a war, Commander, the longest and most desperate one humanity has ever fought, we did something the Architects never accounted for. We didn't just resist them, we studied them back. We learned how their systems worked, how their judgment protocols functioned, how they decided coldly and mathematically who deserved to exist and who didn't. And when the war finally ended, we didn't destroy that knowledge. We inherited it." Threll felt something cold settle in his chest. "You built your own version." "We built something better," Voss said, and for the first time, his voice carried something fierce beneath the calm. "Not a weapon aimed outward at the galaxy. A promise aimed inward at ourselves. A system that would never again let anyone, human or otherwise, be erased simply for being difficult to predict. We turned the very thing that almost ended us into something that protects instead of judges. And for the past 130 years, we've quietly used it to keep watch, not just over our own space, but over dozens of smaller species who would have been easy prey for anything like the Architects that might still be out there." "You've been protecting others," Threll said slowly, "without them knowing. Would you have believed it if we'd announced it?" Voss asked. "A species barely out of its own near extinction, claiming to be the galaxy's quiet guardian. You'd have called it arrogance. So we let the silence speak instead. We let the myth of the quiet grave do the work of a warning label. And we hoped, desperately hoped, that fear would be enough to keep most fleets from ever finding out what was really waiting behind that line." Threll sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of the truth reorganize everything he thought he'd understood about strength, about power, about what it meant to be respected rather than merely feared. "If it's just an automatic defense system," he said finally, the question rising unbidden, "the one thing about today that still doesn't fit, reacting to threats, disarming ships, sealing off a border. Then explain LRA. Explain the voice. Explain the choices. A system doesn't sound sorry about giving a countdown, Doctor. A system doesn't grieve for an enemy officer it never met. Someone or something is making decisions in there. Judgment calls. Mercy calls." He looked between Voss and LRA, who had gone very still. "So tell me the truth," Threll said quietly. "If your system is only automatic defense, then who or what is actually behind that voice giving the orders?" Voss's expression shifted. Not surprise, but the particular stillness of a man who had hoped this question would come later, or not at all. He glanced at LRA, and something unspoken passed between them, heavy with history neither of them seemed eager to share. "That," Voss said slowly, "is the part we don't talk about. Not because it's forbidden, because it's the part almost no one outside our own people has ever been ready to hear. LRA finally spoke, her voice quiet, steady, and, for the first time since Threll had met her, afraid. "Commander," she said, "before I answer that, I need you to understand something about me first, because what I am is the reason that Countdown existed at all, and it's the reason I could never have let your fleet burn, no matter what you did." LRAOA had not been born the way Threll understood birth to work, and the next 10 minutes would rearrange everything he thought he knew about the word human. She sat across from him, hands folded, choosing her words with the care of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times and still hadn't found a version of it that didn't hurt to say out loud. After the war with the architects ended, she began, humanity inherited fragments of their technology, including something they used to make their judgments. A vast, distributed intelligence built to calculate, predict, and decide. When we found it, most of our ancestors wanted to destroy it, burn it to nothing, and never risk becoming what had almost erased us. She paused. A smaller group disagreed. They believed the danger was never the intelligence itself. It was the absence of anything human guiding it. "So you didn't destroy it," Threll said slowly. "You merged with it. Not all at once and not carelessly," LRA said. "It took generations. Volunteers. Always volunteers, Commander. Never conscripts. Those who agreed to become something between the system and the species it now protects. Human enough to remember why mercy matters. Connected enough to carry out judgments a purely emotional mind might be too slow or too frightened to make in time." She met his eyes. "I am one of them. What spoke to you today? What disarmed your fleet in under 3 minutes? It wasn't a machine following cold protocol. It was me and people like me making a choice. The same choice, over and over, every time a fleet like yours crosses that line." Threll sat back, the weight of it settling slowly. "That's why you sounded sorry. That's why you gave a countdown instead of simply ending us the moment we crossed the border. Because the alternative, becoming something that erases first and grieves never, is exactly what the architects were," LRA said. "We swore we would never become that. Not even to protect ourselves. Especially not to protect ourselves." Voss leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Understand what you witnessed today, Commander. It wasn't the deployment of a weapon. It was a system built from the technology of an extinction event, deliberately, painstakingly reshaped by people willing to give up pieces of their own humanity to keep it from ever becoming that again. Every fleet that crosses that line gets the same choice you did. Most turn back before it matters. Few like you don't. And every time someone like LRA has to decide in real time how much mercy the moment can survive." Threll thought of the disarmed fleet, of the crews returned unharmed, of Sale's final words urging him to actually listen this time. He thought of 130 years of silence that he had mistaken for weakness, when it had been, the entire time, a species holding itself to a harder standard than any war had ever demanded of the Dominion. "Why show me this?" Threll asked quietly. "Why tell me the truth at all instead of just sending me home with a warning and a myth?" LRA's expression softened, something almost like hope breaking through the exhaustion. "Because myths keep people away, Commander, but they don't build anything. Every so often, someone crosses that line and survives long enough to actually understand what they found. We hoped every single time that person might go home and start a different kind of conversation. Not stay away from the monsters, but here's what it actually looks like to survive extinction and choose kindness anyway. You could be that person if you're willing." Threll sat in silence for a long moment, turning the offer over, feeling the shape of a future very different from the one he'd imagined when he'd first ordered his fleet across that boundary. "My council will want blood," he said finally. "A dead officer, a stripped fleet. Humiliation on a scale the Dominion hasn't faced in a generation. They won't want a philosophy lesson, Doctor. They'll want revenge." "Then tell them the truth anyway," Voss said. "Tell them exactly what happened. The countdown, the mercy, the choice you were given, and the choice you made. Let them decide what kind of galaxy they want to be part of now that they actually know what's waiting behind that red line." He paused. "Sale believed enough in that truth to spend her dying breath making sure you'd hear it. Don't let that be wasted. Threll closed his eyes. Grief and understanding tangled together in a way he suspected would never fully separate again. The journey home was long, his fleet crawling back across the boundary on minimal power. Every commander and crew member was forced to sit with what they'd witnessed instead of racing toward the next conquest. Threll stood on the bridge of a stripped and silent ash crown, watching Sail's empty station, rehearsing the report he would have to give. Not the report his younger, hungrier self would have written, full of excuses and blame, but the truthful one, the one that might actually matter. Word of the crossing reached the Dominion Council long before Threll's fleet did, carried by the same quiet channels humanity had always used. Not threats, not propaganda, just the plain, unembellished truth offered without demand. What the council did with it surprised almost everyone, including Threll himself. There was no declaration of retaliation, no mustering of war fleets. Instead, quietly and cautiously, a formal request was drafted. Not for surrender, not for alliance, but for something rarer between strangers who'd nearly become enemies. Conversation. Months later, standing at the edge of the very boundary where his career had nearly ended, Threll watched a small, unassuming human vessel approach the same negotiating point where 63 warships had once been disarmed in under 3 minutes. This time, no weapons powered up. No countdown began. Just 2 fleets meeting in careful, uncertain peace in space that had been forbidden for 130 years. Aboard the human relay station, orbiting quietly at the edge of that same boundary, LRAOA watched a new light blink into existence across a display that had, for over a century, shown almost nothing at all. New contact requests, new diplomatic channels, new species finally willing to approach a border they had once only feared. She opened an old warning archive, one she'd been adding to for longer than most Dominion officers had been alive, and typed a new entry beside 62 others exactly like it. A record of a war that had lasted only minutes, that had cost a single life instead of thousands, and that had ended not in conquest but in understanding. She paused before closing the file, thinking of Threll, of Sail, of every fleet that had crossed that line believing strength was the only language the galaxy respected. Then she wrote the line she always wrote at the end of every entry. The one that had never once stopped being true. We didn't win because we were the strongest fleet in the galaxy. We won because every single time, we chose not to become the thing that once tried to erase us. She closed the file, looked out at the quiet dark beyond the boundary, and for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to hope that the next fleet to arrive wouldn't need a countdown at all.